Hello friends, and welcome to Butterfly Meadows Home and Farm. Today we are going to be making bread in the bread machine. I have made bread in the bread machine for over 10 years now, and I have a really simple recipe that's easy to use and almost always fail-proof. So come with me and I'll show you how. Okay, so I have positioned the camera so hopefully you can see what I'm doing, and normally I have my bread machine over here on a counter, but it's kind of in a corner and I want you guys to be able to see well, so I brought it over here on the table so you can watch as I put the ingredients in. And I'm just going to kind of move it over here to the side. And my bread machine is very old. I have had this bread machine for years and years, and at some point we broke the lid, but it works just fine. You just have to pick it up instead of raise it up. And as far as bread machines, there are so many different kinds of bread machines. This is a bread man. I have had several bread mans through the years, and I find they are very good. I don't know even if they still sell them or not. If they do, I will put a link below to Amazon where you can find one similar to this. This one is pretty old. For years and years, my first bread machine was new, and it was rather expensive. It was a Cuisinart, and it was good, and I literally wore it out. And then I started buying bread machines at thrift stores. Find them at thrift stores for several years ago for like $5 and $6, and most of them hadn't even been used maybe once, because people would buy them, get all excited and try to make bread and fail, and then they would just end up donating them to the thrift store. So you can probably still find some at thrift stores. They're probably going to cost you more than $5 or $6 now, but I recommend, if it's your first time and you're just trying to learn to make bread in a bread machine, if you can find a used one, that would be great, because you wouldn't have a lot of money invested in it. Make a sandwich bread is what I'm going to be making. And when you're buying your bread machines, so this one makes the loaf that is long ways. Some of the bread machines have the loaf upright. And I'll be honest, I've had several of those. I never liked any of them. I did not like how they baked the bread. For some reason, the bread always came out much darker with a harder crust than I liked. If you can, I would recommend this kind of loaf pan when you're looking for your bread machine. I even had a bread machine once that did 2 loaves. I didn't like that either. So that's enough about kinds of bread machines. If you have one, no matter what kind it is, pull it out and try it, experiment with it, and you will probably love the result after you give it a try. So this recipe that I have is one that I just through the years tweaked until I got it just the way we like it. My first loaf of bread in my first bread machine, I remember I was so excited. It takes 3 hours or more in the bread machine to make bread. And I remember my first loaf, it finished like at midnight one night. And I remember hearing the little beeper go off, and I'm like, oh, honey, the bread's done, and you want a piece? And so I jumped up and ran in the kitchen and took the bread out and sliced it right away, which you are not supposed to do. You need to let it cool. We ate it with butter and honey on it, and it was delicious and exciting. You really need to let your bread cool. Now that particular loaf, that first loaf, after the bread cooled, it was not good. I don't even know if that first slice was good or if it was just my excitement of having made bread in the bread machine. So anyway, that's my first experience. But what I did was I started just kind of tweaking the recipe until I got it just so. And at the time, we lived in a very humid environment near the coast, and so the recipe that came in the book with the bread machine just didn't work well for me. And I just kept changing the amount of water and different things until I got that beautiful, perfect loaf. And I have used that same recipe ever since, even though I don't live on the coast anymore. I live in the mountains of Kentucky. So I think this recipe should work for you, and I will explain to you what I use in it, and hopefully you can give it a try and be successful in making your bread in your bread machine. I also want to talk a little bit about flour, the kind of flour you will be using to make your bread. Now this is bread flour. Now there are all different kinds of flour. There's all-purpose flour, bread flour, there's high gluten flours, and whole wheat flours, and different kinds of flour. And a lot of people want to make specialty breads in their bread machine. That's why they get one, and they start out using all these specialty flours, and they find that it's just too difficult and the bread does not turn out. I highly recommend, if you are just learning to make bread in your bread machine, to stick with bread flour until you learn how to make it. And once you get your recipe just right, then you can start supplementing your bread flour with other flours. So the thing about bread flour is it has the right amount of gluten to make your bread have that right texture. If you used all-purpose flour, which you could, you would still get bread, but it may not have the texture that you want in your bread. And if you used a high gluten flour, which I have done, you still would get a very nice loaf of bread. And sometimes I do use a high gluten flour just because it gives it such a soft texture. But all in all, for the most part, I use bread flour and it works just fine. And I have here in this bowl 3 cups of bread flour. Now my flour, when I store it, I vacuum seal it. So it's pretty dense. So I have 3 cups here. I did not weigh it. And the reason I'm telling you that I stored it vacuum sealed, and I did not sift it either, but you could do that, is because once my bread starts to mix up, I may find that I need extra water, and that's why I have extra water here. And that's because there may actually be more than 3 cups. And to be exact, you would probably have to weigh your flour. But I just go with 3 level cups of flour, and then I add a little water if I need to once the bread starts to mix up. And I'll show you how I do that once we get to that step. So the ingredients you're going to need is 3 cups of bread flour. You're going to need 1 cup and 1/3 of room temperature water. You'll want a filtered water of some sort. And I have a little bit of extra water here for when my bread starts to mix if I need more. And I have here in this bowl, I have 1/4 of dry milk, 1/4 cup of dry milk. And here I have 2½ tablespoons of sugar. This is 1½ teaspoons of salt, and this is pink Himalayan salt. This is 2½ teaspoons of yeast. And you want active yeast. You can buy bread machine yeast or active yeast. Either one will work the same, and you need 2½ teaspoons. And then you need 2½ tablespoons of oil. And just a few more fun facts to help you as you're learning to make your flour. When I first started making bread, I used honey instead of sugar, and that worked great. But the honey is rather difficult to measure, and honey has gotten so expensive. So I just use sugar now. It's 2½ tablespoons of sugar in a loaf of bread, so I figure that's not that much sugar, so I'm not going to worry about the effects, the health effects of that sugar. But you can use honey. You can use any kind of sugar that you want to use. You do not want to use an artificial sweetener, because this sugar, the purpose of the sugar is so that your yeast has something to feed from. The yeast has to have that sugar to feed so that it can produce the gases to make your bread rise. And also, I'm using 2½ tablespoons of oil. You can also use butter. If you're using butter, you'll want to cut it up into very small pieces and try to have it as close to room temperature as possible. But you can use Crisco, you can use oil, any kind of oil that you want, or you can use butter, or you could use ghee, whatever you wanted to use, but you need some kind of a fat, and this keeps your bread nice and soft. If you leave that out, the bread is going to be very hard, and you're probably not going to like it. And the salt, you can use white salt, table salt. I only use in my house pink Himalayan salt for everything. So that's why I have pink Himalayan salt. And the powdered milk, you could, if you wanted to, you could use milk instead of water, and you could leave the powdered milk out. But powdered milk is something that is easy to store and easy to have on hand, and I've always made my bread with powdered milk, and it turns out great. Okay, so now we are going to assemble our ingredients together in our bread pan. Your bread machine pan will have a beater in the bottom. Mine is pretty roughed up, and I think I even bought this machine used, and it's been used a lot, and so some of the edges are kind of worn, and I even feel a couple of nicks, which I don't think I put in there. It was probably there when I bought it, but you want to make sure you don't leave this out. That has happened to me before. I forgot to put my beater in and the bread didn't mix. So make sure you have your beater in the bottom of your pan. And the first thing, the order you add your ingredients is important. It's not just, okay, dump everything in. It is important that you add them in the proper order. The first thing you want to add is your cup and 1/3 of water. Just pour that right in. And the next thing you want to put in is your fat. And I'm using oil, so I'm just going to put my 2½ tablespoons of oil into my water. And then we are going to add the flour. So we're going to add our flour, and as you add the flour, kind of put it in, and the flour will float on top of the water, and you kind of want to build I usually am putting this in by cupfuls, but I have it in a bowl to make this easier, but you want to cover the top of the water with your flour. And hopefully you can see this on camera. So the flour is on top of the water. And there's a reason that we do that, because we don't want these other ingredients that we're going to add to get wet until the bread actually starts to mix. So we've made kind of a little bed on top to put our ingredients on top of. So we're going to take our powdered milk and we're going to put it in one corner. And then we're going to take our 2½ teaspoons of sugar, 2½ tablespoons of sugar, and we're going to put it in another corner. We are going to take our 2½ teaspoons of yeast and we're going to put it in another corner. Then we're going to take our 1½ teaspoons of salt. We're going to put it in the last corner. Okay, so we have all of our ingredients in our pan, and we're going to snap our pan into the bread machine. You want to make sure it clicks in. They're all a little bit different, but just make sure that it clicks in. And I'm going to bring the camera down here where I can try to show you the settings on my bread machine, so I can show you how to set it. And I'm not going to worry about putting the lid on yet, and I'll show you why. Okay, I'm going to try to hold the camera while I show you this because I just can't get a good view with it on the stand, so I apologize if it's shaky. But this is going to make a 2-pound loaf, and if I hit the menu button one time, it goes to white bread. And white bread is what we want. And then I have another button here that controls the crust. And I want light crust. If you put it on medium crust or dark crust, what that does is the bread will bake a little longer and your crust will get darker. I have found that in this machine and most every other machine I've had, anything except light crust dries the bread out. So I always use light crust. If you like a dark, crunchy crust, you can definitely try the other setting. And then the loaf is already on 2 pound. If it wasn't, I would push this little loaf button until I got to the 2 pound. And so it says 3 hours to bake. You can also set delays if you want the bread to bake at a later time. You can add to the time that it's going to take to bake, and then it will bake. It will come on later and bake. So we are going to hit the start button, and the bread begins to mix. And it's really amazing how that little paddle mixes up all of this bread. And I don't know if you can hear the rain, but we are having very heavy rains here. So if you hear that, that's what that is. Now, I'm going to try to put the camera back on the stand and show you how I know if there is enough water in my bread. So hopefully you can see down in this pan. And this bread, this dough is not wet enough. You see how it's kind of raggedy and there's a lot of dry? So I'm just going to add like about a tablespoon or less of water at a time. And then I take my little spatula and scrape down the sides. You want to be careful not to get too much water, but you want to make sure you have enough. And I'm sure all of this extra adding water and such could be avoided if I weighed my flour and sifted it. But since I don't, I just do this and it works just fine. And that actually is looking pretty good. I just added about a tablespoon. And you can see the dough ball is coming together. Now that's going to beat for quite a while, and I'm going to show you at different intervals how that ball of dough changes. Now while this dough is beating, I just thought I would talk to you a little bit about a few tips. I know that some people love the bread machine because they can set it ahead of time and like put it on in the morning and go off to work and come home, and you would have your bread ready to come out of the bread machine. And of course that would be difficult to do the way I'm doing it since I had to add water. But once you get the feel of how much flour you need and how much water you need, you can definitely do that. Like I know that I probably have to add an extra tablespoon or two of water to mine in order for there to be enough water in this dough. So if I was going to set it and set the timer, that's what I would do, is I would add some water to my cup and 1/3 of water. And there are so many different recipes out there, and you can definitely experiment with them. I have used a recipe where I use milk and an egg, and that makes a wonderful bread. I like this recipe because it's simple. All of the ingredients are easy to store. They're shelf-stable ingredients, and I like that. And the bread turns out really, really good. And hopefully you can see that dough ball and how it is coming together. It's really amazing how that little paddle does all of that work and kneads the bread so that you don't have to. And so at this point, now that I know my bread has enough water and the dough ball is coming together, I can put the lid on and just come back when the timer goes off at the end of the 3 hours. A few more things I wanted to talk about though while this dough ball is beating. Don't be tempted to put more yeast than the recipe calls for, or more sugar than the recipe calls for. And the reason is, if you do that, the yeast, what I say, the yeast gets way too happy and way too excited, and your bread will rise up way too tall, and it will be full of holes. And when it cools, it will most likely sink in the middle. So you don't want to do that. So add the called for amount of yeast and the called for amount of sugar, and you won't have that problem. The bread should rise to just a little bit above the loaf pan or right at the edges of the loaf pan. That's a good rise for your bread. Also, some machines, and this machine probably does, I never pay any attention to it, they will beep and tell you when you can take the little paddle out. And when it beeps, you just lift the lid and reach under there, move the dough ball, and take the paddle out. This keeps you from having that big hole in your bread where the beater is. I'm always doing something else and I never catch it, so I just leave it in there and then I take it out. Yes, it does leave a little bit of a hole, but we don't mind. Also, something you need to know is when your bread finishes, when that little timer goes off, you do want to take it out of the bread machine, because this bread machine will stay warm and it will dry out your bread. So just get you a pot holder and lift it out and sit it on a towel, and then as quickly as possible take it out of the pan. And I'll show you how I do that when this bread is done. And the reason you don't want to leave it in the pan is it will sweat, And you don't want your bread to be wet, and if you leave it in the pan, it'll sweat as it begins to cool. So I always set mine on a towel and cover it with the towel and let it cool that way. This just makes the bread not be wet and sweat, and it gives it a chance to cool. You do have to let it cool before you cut it. So we're gonna let this do its thing. I'll try to take a few pictures throughout the process if I can to let you see how it's coming along. And that dough ball just gets more beautiful the more it beats. It's just amazing how that happens. It's a good texture. Let's let it go and we'll come back and look at it in a few minutes. I just wanted to show you where the bread is. So it's been going for about 40 minutes and it is on its first rise. If you can see there, it says rise. And this is the first rise, and it's already begun to rise. I can tell the dough ball is bigger. I'm going to put the lid back on because I don't want to let out. It does have a little heat, warmth in there to help the bread rise. It will rise, and then it will beat down again. And I'll try to get a little bit clip of that when that starts to show you the process. Okay, just wanted to show you guys. This is on rise number 2. Did beat briefly, just enough to beat the rise number 1 down. I was going to show you it is rising considerably more this time. And I believe I will try, I've never paid that close of attention before. I think it's going to beat one more time and then it will rise and bake. So it just beat the dough ball down again, and you can see over here it says it's on rise number 3. So I am going to go ahead and take my paddle out. Okay, so I went ahead and took my paddle out since it is on rise number 3. And that way I never do that because I'm never paying that much attention. But that way I won't have to pull it out when my loaf is finished. You can see it has 1 hour and 29 minutes left and it's on rise number 3. Okay, so at 40 minutes left, it switched from rise number 3 to bake. Hopefully you can see that. And the bread has, since it just started, I'm going to take off the lid and let you see it has risen very nicely. It might rise just a little more while it's baking. And so it has 40 minutes to go. It smells absolutely wonderful. And I will show you what it looks like when it is finished. So there is our beautiful loaf of bread. So I'm just going to set it here. And I'll set the camera up on the stand and show you how I take it out of the pan. So we have our bread out of the bread machine and it's in our pan, and I usually just get 2 pot holders of some type and take the bread and gently pop it out, and then I turn it over on its end. Then I take my my towel that I have and I just kind of wrap it up. So I'm going to let this cool for probably a half an hour to an hour, and then I'll come back and show you how I slice it. So our bread has been cooling for about an hour, and here it is. I have, and you can see the little hole. It's not a very big hole because I was able to take the paddle out. And this is my bread slicer, and you can also find these at thrift stores a lot of times. They make all different kinds. I've had several, and this is the one that I have right now, and you just set your bread in here. And I use an electric knife. You could use any serrated knife, but I use an electric knife to cut mine. And just a little tip, always start on the front end of your bread and slice back. You see how it is kind of tilted back? So you want to start on the high end and slice back, because if you start back here and start slicing forward, your bread slices will be uneven because the bread changes as you slice it. So always start up here at the beginning, and we're just going to slice this up, and then I'll show you what the inside looks like. So we have our bread sliced now, and just take it out here so you can see. It's very evenly sliced, and it has a beautiful texture. There you can see the texture of the bread. It is just like, really just like store-bought loaf bread that you would buy, to me. And now I'm going to show you how I store it. I'm going to set it back in here so that it doesn't fall all apart, and I'll show you how I store it. So what I have here is a 2-gallon Ziploc bag, and you can find these at Walmart. You can find them at the dollar store, most anywhere that sells Ziploc bags. And I think this is one of the cheaper ones that came from the dollar store. But you will need a 2-gallon size in order to fit your loaf in. And I just place the bread in the bag. And then you want to keep as much air out of the bag as possible. And if I were going to store this long term, I would probably stick a straw in the bag and suck out as much of the air as possible, and then seal the bag shut. So you do want to keep as much of the air as possible out of the bag, because this is homemade bread. It does not have preservatives in it that the bread you buy in the store has to keep it soft. So you do want to keep all of the air out of the bag as much as possible. And another little tip on something that I do, and I will probably do that with this loaf, after I slice it and seal it up in my bag, I put it in the freezer for at least 24 hours. And I have found that my bread keeps fresh so much longer if I do that. I put it in the freezer for 24 hours, then I take it out and let it thaw before I get ready to use it, and it stays fresh so much longer. I'm not sure exactly what happens, why that works. Maybe the freezer stops the action of the yeast and the things that are in the bread that cause the bread to rise. I don't know, but I just know that it works. So I'm probably going to do that with this loaf. I'll probably stick it in the freezer for 24 hours and then take it out, and then we'll use it to make sandwiches or whatever we would use sliced bread for. I certainly hope that you will give this a try. If you have a bread machine or know someone that has a bread machine that doesn't want it, I hope you will give this a try, because once you start eating this homemade bread, it is so much better, and you start to like it so much better. And it's really not difficult to do. And the more you do it, the easier it gets. And hey, if you have a loaf that fails every now and then, don't beat yourself up. Sometimes that happens. Sometimes we get in a hurry and don't measure our ingredients just right, or perhaps it could be the humidity in the air, who knows what. But just keep on making your bread, and you will become a pro at it in no time. Thanks for stopping by Butterfly Meadows Home and Farm today. I'm so glad you did. If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing to my channel. Hit that like button and that little bell, and watch some of my other videos that you see here. God bless. Bye-bye.